So imagine you're having a chat with someone about their work and your work, and it comes up in the conversation that you travel regularly from the UK to work in, let's say, Switzerland. If you were asked, is it safe? What would you say? Or they might ask you, if you're a woman, is it okay for you to be traveling alone? Shouldn't you be traveling with your husband? And they might say, no one speaks English. How do you manage? So, as you may imagine, none of these statements is true. I've never had a problem. I've always been treated with respect and welcomed. And overwhelmingly, my interest and work in the Middle East has often been gratefully received and appreciated, almost honoured. Some people have been really surprised that anyone would go to that amount of trouble to get to know the culture and the people. So I've been visiting the Middle East for work for nearly 10 years, and yet even now I get asked these types of questions by people I think are quite well educated, people in business here, business meetings I've gone to, because people don't really understand how the Middle East works and why I go. And I love the culture, the energy, the humour and the friendliness in the Middle East. And if you come across a culture that you're not so familiar with, it is understandable that you may stereotype it a bit. But in my experience of working in the Middle East and then people getting to know the fact that I work in the Middle East, these stereotypes are relied on so heavily. And I think it's important to understand a bit more about the nuances in the region, especially if you want to do business there. So first of all, I think there's the issue of the name. So what do we mean by the Middle East? The whole region is often described as the Middle East. There's also the Middle East and North Africa, which is referred to as MENA. And sometimes the Middle East literally means the countries from the middle of the region. There's also what's known as the Gulf countries, of which there are 7. So it is quite confusing knowing what you're talking about. And you may be surprised to know that there are 21 countries that comprise this region, and they're not all the same, any more than countries in Europe are all the same. Some are more traditional, others are very modernized, and many lie somewhere in between. So here's an example of the traditional, and then I'll give you an example of the modern. So I was working for a large government-owned energy company in the region with a group, including one particular older gentleman, very traditional, who didn't shake my hand when we first met, which is fine. And I was used to this. Rather than a handshake, he held his hand to his chest like this, and I did the same. And at one of the group sessions, we sat in a circle, on chairs, obviously, in a small lounge in a hotel where we were based. And he and I happened to end up being seated side by side. And while we were waiting for the rest of the group to arrive, I noticed out of the corner of my eye that his chair seemed to be moving very slowly away from mine. And I was a bit puzzled, and I kind of looked and glanced, and bit by bit, it was moving further away. And eventually, there was a big gap magically between us. He'd done it very carefully, very subtly, so as not to offend me. And one of the female members of the group picked up her chair and brought it over and filled the gap. And after the meeting, she explained to me that in his tradition, it wasn't appropriate for him to sit next to someone who wasn't from his culture. And we met together several times as a group over the next few months. And at the end of our very last meeting, he came to me and proffered his hand. And I knew that this was really important, and I was extremely touched. And some people might think all men are like this with women, but they're not. So let me give you another example. Early on in my work experience, I was coaching someone from the Middle East in London. He was well educated, I thought very sophisticated. He traveled abroad to study and on holiday, and he talked a lot about his family life. He was married, and when he met his wife, she was working. He showed me pictures. He asked all about my family. He also wanted to see pictures. To be honest, that was a struggle, partly because when you're doing your coach training, you learn that coaching is all about the client and not about you, and you don't talk about yourself. But worse than that, I knew I was so embarrassed when I got out my phone because most of my recent pictures were of my dogs, and I had to do a really hard search for photos of my children. After this, he showed me a picture of a pair of, let's say, quite dressy, very high-heeled shoes in a picture that his wife had asked him to buy for her from a well-known department store in London. He asked me what I thought of them. And I said they were lovely, of course, although to be honest, I wondered how anyone could walk in shoes with such a high heel, and certainly not me. At our next meeting, I inquired after the shoes. He was still in London at this stage. He hadn't been able to get those particular shoes, but he had found a pair that was similar. He showed me the picture. What did I think? I said, of course, that I thought they were fabulous. Again, I privately wondered how anybody could walk on those heels. And after these exchanges, our coaching moved into the pattern of working that I'm familiar with. The point was, it was the relationship building that mattered to him. I'd passed the test. I'd fortunately understood the process, and it was a good learning for me. It's all about relationships. Build the relationship, and if you want to do business, you'll build a trust. And just like building any relationship, understanding the common drivers involved is where you have to start. And what these Arab nations all have in common is their approach to how they interact. I've come to the conclusion that there are three aspects of life in the Middle East which form the core of life there. I call them the 3 F's. Firstly, there's faith. It's bound through and through in most family lives in the Arab world. It's the heart of how families live, their traditions, many of their laws, and how they behave. And then there's family. Family life is at the center of daily life. Families often live either in the same house with grandparents, children, grandchildren, extended family, or they live close by. And at weekends and holiday times, they spend all their time together. And then there's food, the final of the 3 F's. When you arrive at a meeting, you always, first of all, get offered coffee, dates, or chocolates, or sweets, asked how you are, how's your family, and you ask the same. And I bring something too. Not only that, when you've done a piece of work or you've done something for somebody or several people, you get a gift, which is usually food. I did a piece of work with a big group over several months. And on my last day, they ushered me into this meeting room where everybody I'd worked with, which was a big group of 30 people, were waiting, poised. And they led me very ceremoniously to a huge cake with my name on it and fruit and beautifully decorated. And it was their thank you. And bear in mind, this was 10 o'clock in the morning because they start at 7:30. And the last thing I really felt like eating was a big slab of cake. But I had to eat my slice before they had theirs. And they handed me this special cake slice. It felt a bit like a wedding, except I didn't have a groom. So what about the gender issue? What about the myths and the reality? Well, it is complicated. There's no doubt about it. There's, first of all, as I've already mentioned, the family tradition. The core of the way of going is based on this faith. And Islamic belief grew out of the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. In 571 CE, the Common Era, men were the decision makers, women should be protected and taken care of. They were seen as the weaker sex, frail, homemakers and carers of the family and the children. And each community had a regular gathering of wise elders, always the men, and somebody or several who passed judgments on misdemeanors, neighborly fights, and so on. They decided the laws, and inevitably they decided them often in favor of men and not of women. Elders were always respected, particularly grandparents. And this respect for elders is still there today. Secondly, some of the complexities around expectations. So boys grew up expecting to hold the power in their families. And these expectations created by their mothers and fathers of being treated as sort of the special one became part of their DNA. And girls were brought up to know their place, but they did have some power. So they had grown up expecting to be looked after, and if it wasn't up to scratch, they could divorce. And this kind of life still exists. And this is where the challenge lies, because now, with the result, as a result of the advances of social media, even in those countries where some of it's blocked, many women are learning that gender equity is happening in other parts of the world, and they're demanding it too. There's also education and the impact at work, where these challenges often show up the most. Many women travel abroad for education. Some are accompanied by a relative, either a male, sometimes their mothers. I met one person who went to the States for a year and she took her mother. Her mother had never gone abroad ever, and her mother had a ball. She saw lots of sights, she played tourist for a year and really enjoyed herself. And another person I met went on her own. And she went because her father wanted her to study a particular degree, which she didn't really want to study. She actually wanted to do art. So she went on her own and by stealth gradually won the argument that she was really, her heart was in art, and that's where she ended up. Many governments are encouraging equality for women and men, and also education for all. And fathers in particular, which may be a surprise, are encouraging their daughters to get educated first and foremost. And in tertiary education, believe it or not, women outnumber men by 2 to 1. But the problem comes when they go into work, and where you have this upward curve of women in their education. By the time they go into work, their careers tend to go down while men's rise. So they move into what's called the squeezed middle. And that's where some of the issues arise around gender. In the Gulf in particular, most people who work are employed in the public sector. And I've worked in this sector quite a bit. And senior positions are often held by men, and they create bottlenecks. And they've been there a long time. Some of them are much more traditional. They're older. They don't really approve of women working. They think they should be at home. And it is hard for these men when they've been brought up with these expectations of power and that they're more superior. It's hard for them also to accept the phenomenal change that's happening in the region. There's also more push from young people. The tradition of having large families means that 60% of the population are under 30. So things are changing and changing very quickly. So the public sector suits some women because the hours tend to be slightly shorter and it's easier if they've got small children, but they are also asking for more seniority, more leadership opportunities and development. And there are lots of women entrepreneurs now. They've set up their own businesses. More women are living alone. The divorce rates are going up, which is a concern in some of these countries where it's not something that's particularly approved of. So one young woman I spoke to lived in one city and worked in another, and it was a long drive. She was desperate for a bit of freedom. Every day, her car journey was an hour and a half each way, so 3 hours in the car. She persuaded her parents to be less fatigued. It would help her to live in the city where she worked. And actually what she wanted was to be independent. They eventually agreed on condition that she came home at the weekend. She said to me, she would eventually start spending more time in her own apartment, and her approach was slowly. And that's what a lot of women do. And they do rise to senior levels. And it has to be said that they don't often help women who are coming up behind them, and that happens everywhere. It's not the same everywhere in the region. In Lebanon, for instance, women have been able to work for a long time. In Jordan, the world of work is more difficult because it's more traditional. And I met a woman who came across a woman who ended up learning how to be a plumber because she had to wait ages for leaks to be fixed because her husband had to be there. And so she ended up training other plumbers. And this was a way for people to get some independence, earn some money, and get some kind of career, feeling that they were a little bit more independent. Governments are helping enormously. They are pushing forward for women to become more empowered. And it's given women that sense of, I can do this, more confidence in spite of the resistance. And I've talked to many women and men over the years, and there are lots of men who want to see this too, and not all men are against it. And what I do think that women are finding more now is, rather than having mentoring, which is quite difficult in some parts of the Middle East, because mentoring usually means that people are in a room together and then that's frowned upon. What I really believe these women who want to progress need is sponsors, and they are usually the men. And the reason this works really well is because those men can actually encourage other men to do the same. And it encourages women to come forward and ask for a sponsor. And if one man hears another man talking about the fact that he sponsors a young woman who wants to come into a leadership position and that he's getting kudos for this, it's more likely to appeal to other men too, because they like the status and they like to know that they're the same. Status is terribly important, and getting things wrong, making mistakes, causes an awful lot of sense of shame. And that's a really strong feeling in this society. I had worked with somebody who was in a financial services, hated it, actually wanted to open a restaurant. And I talked to him about why he felt he couldn't do this. And he said, because it would bring shame on his mother. So that's also something very important to think about. So it's a complex situation. There are lots of nuances, but it's not one amorphous blob. And let's face it, there are many countries around the world that have a long way to go to, not least in the UK. But things won't change without collaborative conversations between women and men. And this applies to this wonderful and vibrant region just as much as anywhere else in the world. And it is the only way to achieve gender equality and gender equity everywhere. Thank you.